The Cleveland media has an agenda against Shedeur Sanders, and the proof is sitting right out in the open for anyone willing to look at it honestly. We are talking about a coordinated, deliberate, undeniable pattern of behavior from local media voices who have spent months manufacturing reasons to dismiss Shedeur Sanders while simultaneously inventing enthusiasm for quarterbacks they have never watched play a single snap. That is not an opinion, that is what is happening, and today we are going to document every layer of it. Welcome back. This is Hot News, and today we are ripping the doors off the Cleveland media's anti-Shedeur Sanders agenda and exposing the absolute fraudulence of the Brendan Sorsby hype machine for exactly what it is. Let me be entirely clear with you right now before we go any further. This is not about whether Shedeur Sanders is perfect. This is not about whether the Cleveland Browns have questions at the quarterback position. Every single person watching this video understands that Cleveland has had quarterback uncertainty for years. That is not the story. The story is what the Cleveland media establishment is doing with that uncertainty. They are weaponizing it. They are using the genuine anxiety of a fan base that has suffered through decades of quarterback disasters to push a narrative that is built on bias, laziness, and a hateful spirit directed specifically at one man. And that man is Shedeur Sanders. I want you to sit with that framing for a second, because it matters. The Cleveland media's problem with Shedeur Sanders is not analytical. It is not film-based. It is not rooted in any serious evaluation of his college career, his mechanics, his football IQ, or his accolades. It is personal. It is emotional. And the Brendan Sorsby situation has now ripped that mask completely off their faces. Here is what happened. Voices within the Cleveland media ecosystem began pushing the idea that the Browns should pursue Brendan Sorsby through the supplemental draft. They framed it as a legitimate football conversation. They presented it as a reasonable alternative. And they did all of this with the confidence of people who had done their homework. Except they had not done their homework. They had not watched Sorsby play. They had not broken down his film. They had not studied his accolades, his statistics, or his track record at the college level. They were posing, that is the only word for it. Posing. And here is the brutal, unavoidable truth about what posing looks like in the sports media industry. You do not actually watch the games. You do not sit down on a Saturday afternoon and evaluate prospects. You are too important for that, apparently. So instead you text somebody, you get a second-hand opinion, and then you go on air and you present that second-hand opinion as though it came from your own rigorous analysis. And when someone asks you directly, what did you actually see when you watched this player perform, you cannot answer the question. You deflect, you reference someone else, you change the subject, because you were never actually watching the tape, you were never actually watching the film, you were never actually doing the work. That is the Cleveland media establishment right now. That is what they are doing. And the reason they are doing it is not because Brendan Sorsby is a superior quarterback prospect to the options already in the room. It is because they dislike Shedeur Sanders so much that they will anoint any alternative, regardless of whether that alternative has been evaluated, regardless of whether that alternative makes football sense, and regardless of whether that alternative comes with serious off-field concerns that these same voices would use to crucify any other player in any other situation. Let me walk you through the evidence, because the evidence is damning and it needs to be laid out clearly. First, the Brendan Sorsby hype is completely manufactured. Before Sorsby became relevant to the supplemental draft conversation, he was not being discussed as one of the top quarterback prospects in the upcoming class. He was not on anyone's serious list of the 4 or 5 quarterbacks to watch coming out in the next cycle. Nobody was putting him in that tier. Nobody was treating him as a can't-miss prospect. Nobody was comparing him to the elite quarterback talent that was expected to define the next draft class. He was not Arch Manning. He was not Dante Moore. He was not a Notre Dame prospect drawing national attention. He was not in that conversation. And then suddenly, the moment a supplemental draft opportunity materialized, the Cleveland media discovered an urgency for Brendan Sorsby that they had never expressed before. That urgency did not come from film study. It did not come from careful evaluation. It came from a desire to find an alternative to Shedeur Sanders. Any alternative, even one they had never watched. Second, the comparative argument collapses the moment you apply it honestly. Sorsby does not have better statistics than Shedeur Sanders. Sorsby does not have the accolades that Shedeur Sanders has. Sorsby was not being discussed as a top prospect before this moment, and yet the Cleveland media is presenting him as though he represents a meaningful upgrade or a legitimate solution to the quarterback question. That is not analysis. That is not football reasoning. That is bias dressed up in football language, and it falls apart the moment you ask one simple question: if the shoe was on the other foot, would it rock? That question was put to a broader audience, and the answer was overwhelming. An enormous majority, over 90%, said that if Shedeur Sanders had been the one with the off-field turmoil, the same Cleveland media voices pushing for Sorsby would not be advocating for Sanders. They would be using those off-field issues as ammunition. They would be dragging him through the mud. They would be citing character concerns, franchise culture, organizational standards. They would be referencing every standard they have ever claimed to hold, and they would be doing it loudly, repeatedly, and without apology. But because it is not Shedeur Sanders in that situation, because it is a different quarterback with different off-field circumstances, the Cleveland media establishment has decided that the standards do not apply. That is what selective morality looks like in real time, and it is absolutely, ruthlessly, undeniably on display right now. Third, and this is the part that should make every Cleveland Browns fan genuinely angry, the same voices pushing for Sorsby are the same voices who spent years criticizing the Browns front office every single time a player with character concerns was brought in. Every time a trade was made, every time a signing happened, every time a draft pick was selected, and there was any kind of character question attached to that player, these voices were there with the criticism. Andrew Berry heard it, the organization heard it. The standard was clear. Character matters, the culture of this franchise matters. You cannot bring in players with serious off-field issues and expect it to end well. And now those same voices want the Browns to spend a fourth-round supplemental draft pick on a player who is publicly dealing with serious personal struggles. They want to bring that situation into a franchise that has a documented painful history with exactly these kinds of circumstances. They want to blow up the moral framework they themselves constructed, because they dislike the quarterbacks currently in the building so much that they are willing to compromise everything they said they stood for. Let me say that again so it lands. They are willing to compromise everything they said they stood for, because they do not like Shedeur Sanders. Now let me talk about the never-ending quarterback search, because it is its own category of absurdity and it deserves its own examination. The Cleveland media has been doing this for years. Every few months, a new quarterback flavor of the month emerges. Cade Klubnik was the Browns' future quarterback. Then his stock fell back to earth. Gary Nesmeier was labeled a top Browns target. Then his stock went cold. Drew Aller had the Cleveland connection. Questions remained. He did not deliver. Before any of that, Arch Manning was being floated as a potential #1 pick, and then he went back to school. Dante Moore was the answer for a moment. Then that moment passed. This is a pattern. This is a documented, repeating, glaring pattern of the Cleveland media establishment latching onto a new quarterback name every few weeks, building up that name with urgency and excitement, and then watching that urgency evaporate when the player does not materialize or does not pan out. And now the latest entry on that list is Brendan Sorsby, the latest flavor of the month, the latest manufactured solution to a problem that the media itself is making worse by refusing to give the current situation any room to breathe. And here is the football argument that the Cleveland media does not want you to think about too carefully. Even if you set aside every character concern, every off-field issue, every question about whether this player is in a position to be a starting quarterback for an NFL franchise right now, even if you waved all of that away, Brendan Sorsby is not going to have a meaningful impact on the Cleveland Browns winning or losing in 2026. That is the practical reality. You are not drafting a supplemental pick and turning that into a franchise quarterback in one offseason. It does not work that way. And the cost of that supplemental pick, a fourth-round selection, is not trivial. The Browns front office has shown real skill at turning draft assets into legitimate contributors. A fourth-round pick in the right hands can become a bona fide star. You are burning that asset on a player you have not seriously evaluated, in a situation that does not serve the organization, to satisfy a media narrative that is driven by personal animosity toward a different quarterback. That is the actual trade-off being proposed, and the Cleveland media does not want you to look at it that way. There is also the deeper hypocrisy that sits underneath all of this, and it connects to something much larger than just the Browns or just Shedeur Sanders. The sports media world, the NFL, professional sports broadly, they all operate on what you could accurately call selective morality. The rules are not applied consistently. The standards are not applied equally. You can look at the history of how the league has handled various player situations, serious conduct issues, documented behavioral problems, off-field circumstances that would end careers in other industries, and you will see that the standard shifts depending on how much a team needs a particular player. If you are good enough, the league will find a way to keep you on the field. That is the reality. But there is one category where the selective morality breaks down, where the league and its partners stop being flexible, and that is gambling. Because gambling puts a stain on the name, and when you put a stain on the name, you put a stain on the pocket. And when the pocket is threatened, suddenly the standards are absolute and non-negotiable. That is the only area where the sports establishment actually holds the line consistently. Everything else is negotiable. Gambling is not. The Cleveland media establishment operates on the same selective morality framework. Their standards are flexible when it benefits the narrative they want to push. Pete Rose was one of the greatest hitters in the history of baseball, and he died outside the Hall of Fame because of gambling. The same people who enforced that standard with absolute rigidity are the ones now telling you that a quarterback's off-field struggles should be overlooked because the Browns need a signal caller. The same people who have spent years telling you that character matters, that the culture of the franchise matters, that you cannot build something real on a broken foundation. Those people are now asking you to ignore all of that because they hate Shedeur Sanders more than they love their own stated principles. I want to be specific about what the Cleveland media has been putting into the public conversation about Shedeur Sanders, because it matters for understanding just how deep this bias runs. The narrative that was built around Sanders during the draft process was deliberate and it was false. The story was that he fell in the draft because of bad interviews, that he needed to be humbled, that his father cost him draft position, that his character was a problem. These narratives were pushed repeatedly, daily, with the confidence of people who had access to insider information, and they were used to justify the position that Shedeur Sanders was not a legitimate NFL prospect. And then the same people pushing those narratives turned around and started clamoring for Brendan Sorsby, a player who was not being discussed as a top quarterback prospect before this moment, a player with no comparable accolades, a player whose statistics do not exceed Sanders, a player who, when evaluated against the actual top prospects in the upcoming class, Arch Manning, Dante Moore, the elite talent coming out of programs like Notre Dame, does not belong in the same conversation. But somehow, in the Cleveland media's telling, Sorsby is the answer, and Shedeur Sanders is the problem. I am going to put my name on this. The Cleveland media's campaign against Shedeur Sanders is not going to age well. The bias is too obvious. The double standard is too glaring. The manufactured enthusiasm for alternatives who have not been seriously evaluated is too transparent. When the Browns do not pursue Brendan Sorsby through the supplemental draft, and when the Cleveland franchise continues building through 2 consecutive strong draft classes with young players who are genuinely exciting, the same voices who spent this offseason pushing the Sorsby narrative are going to quietly move on to the next flavor of the month. They will not acknowledge what they did. They will not reckon with the bias they displayed. They will just find a new name, build a new urgency, and pretend the previous cycle never happened. Shedeur Sanders, meanwhile, is going to be in an NFL system doing exactly what NFL quarterbacks do in their first year. Learning, developing, competing, and the establishment that tried to use every tool at its disposal to diminish him before he even took a professional snap is going to have to reckon with the fact that none of it worked. The narrative collapsed because it was built on bias, not evidence. It was built on a hateful spirit, not football analysis. And those foundations do not hold. The Cleveland media establishment does not want you to apply the same standard to Brendan Sorsby that they applied to Shedeur Sanders. They do not want you to ask whether Sorsby's film is actually there. They do not want you to ask why he was not being discussed as a top prospect before the supplemental draft opportunity emerged. They do not want you to ask why a player who was going back to Texas Tech is suddenly a can't-miss franchise quarterback. They do not want you to flip the script and ask what they would be saying if the circumstances were reversed. Because the moment you ask those questions, the entire argument disintegrates. The math does not work. The film argument does not work. The character argument, applied consistently, does not work. The only thing that works in the Cleveland media's case against Shedeur Sanders and for Brendan Sorsby is the bias itself. And that is not football analysis. That is an agenda. Drop your most honest take in the comments right now. Is the Cleveland media running a coordinated agenda against Shedeur Sanders, using the quarterback position as cover for a bias that has nothing to do with football evaluation? Or is there a legitimate football argument for Brendan Sorsby over the options already in the building that I am missing? Pick a side, commit to it. I want every opinion that is willing to stand behind one position, because the conversation around this is too important to leave in the middle. Hit the notification bell because this story is not finished. The supplemental draft window is still open, the Cleveland media is still pushing this narrative, and every new development is going to expose another layer of what we documented today. We will see you in the next video.